Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome Lloyd Chapman. He is the founder and president of the American Small Business League. Appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to have me.
An organization based in California?
Yes.
The president today in New Jersey talking about small businesses. From your standpoint, 18 months into his administration, has he done what you expected him to do with regard to small businesses?
Absolutely not. I'm very disappointed. I actually campaigned for President Obama. I backed him, and I get up at 4:30 in the morning and do radio shows all across the country. And he said he'd do a couple things. He said he'd end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. He said he'd restore the SBA's budget and staffing. He said he'd implement the 5% set-aside goal for women. He said he'd restore the SBA budget and staffing. And he said he would restore the SBA administrator to a cabinet-level position. He's done none of those things. And I'm really surprised, to tell you the truth, because most Americans work for small businesses. I think 52% of the private sector workforce are employed by small businesses. They create virtually 100% of the net new jobs. Small businesses are responsible for 90% of the exports, 90% of the innovations. And yet the Obama administration has given small businesses, I would just say, an insignificant amount of money from the stimulus. And every day they're giving most of the federal small business contracts to some of the biggest companies in the world. So I'm very disappointed.
What can the federal government do to create jobs or to help small businesses? Because you have that constant debate of the individual entrepreneur who doesn't want high taxes, doesn't want regulation, and may not want government dollars. And yet what you seem to be saying is that the SBA and others have a job or a role in trying to spur small business growth.
Well, you know, there's a federal law that says that a minimum of 23% of all federal contracts should go to small businesses. And that's based on the Small Business Act from 1953. It makes sense, you know, since small business create all the net new jobs. And that's probably the largest program, in fact, it is the largest program to direct federal infrastructure spending to the middle-class economy. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find even one small business owner that thinks that Fortune 500 firms should get federal small business contracts. So I think, you know, small businesses would very much like to get the appropriate volume of federal contracts that they're supposed to get.
The president talking about small businesses yesterday in the Rose Garden. Here's what he said.
Many of these businesses still can't get the loans and the capital they need to keep their doors open and hire new workers. That's why we've proposed steps to get them that help. Eliminating capital gains taxes on investments, making it easier for small lenders to support small businesses, expanding successful SBA programs to help these businesses access the capital that they need. This is how we create jobs, by investing in the innovators and entrepreneurs that have always driven our prosperity. These are the kind of common sense steps that folks from both parties have supported in the past. Steps to cut taxes and spur private sector growth and investment. And I hope that in the coming days we'll once again find common ground and get this legislation passed. We shouldn't let America's small businesses be held hostage to partisan politics, and certainly not at this critical time.
President, yesterday as he outlined his domestic and foreign policy agenda for the remainder of this Congress, Lloyd Chapman, your reaction?
Well, I think about a term a friend of mine uses called chin music. It's just all talk, in my opinion. So when you see President Obama talking about his concern for small businesses, realize that the most recent information released by the Obama administration showed that the largest recipient of federal small business contract was Textron, a Fortune 500 firm with, I think, 43,000 employees and annual revenue of $43 billion. And they got around $785 million in federal small business contracts in a single year. That data also showed that companies in Italy, England, Holland, France, and South Korea are getting federal small business contracts. So, you know, I'm not impressed by that. In fact, to tell you the truth, here's what I predict. He talks about an exemption on investments in small business, an exemption from capital gains tax. I think that's going to be a loophole for venture capitalists. I don't think it's any coincidence that Karen Mills, the head of the SBA, is a former venture capitalist. The head of the SBA Office of Advocacy is a venture capitalist. And I believe the White House contact person, I forgot her name, the small business person, is also a venture capitalist. And I'm been predicting for a year that President Obama is going to do what I call a two-prong loophole for venture capitalists. He's going to exempt the investments in small business from capital gains tax. And number two, he's going to try to change the federal definition of a small business from being independently owned to include companies owned by some of the wealthiest venture capitalists in the country. And in my opinion, I think that they're going to try to essentially sell this country's small business contracting programs to the venture capitalists. And the National Venture Capital Association has been very aggressive in making contributions to both the House and Senate Small Business Committee to try to get that legislation passed.
We're talking with Lloyd Chapman, the founder and president of the American Small Business League. We hope you'll join the discussion. Give us a phone call. The number's on the bottom of the screen. You can also send us an email, journal@cspan.org, or check us out at twitter.com/cspanwj. Two of the most significant pieces of legislation signed into law: the health care bill, signed this past March, and more recently, the Wall Street Regulatory Reform Bill. Some saying it's reform, others saying it's regulation. But how do those two pieces of legislation impact small businesses?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure how the Wall Street reform is going to affect small business, quite frankly. I don't think many people have really fully come to grips with that bill.
But it does mean a lot of government agencies that will oversee the regulation of how Wall Street works. And I guess the question is, does that trickle down into any regulation for small businesses?
You know, I don't think so. I really don't. The only thing I can think of is that if they regulate Wall Street more, we're less likely to have another economic meltdown like we had in the past. And I think that I'm still waiting to see how the healthcare bill actually, pans out. But I'm just kind of concerned about the healthcare bill. It's going to provide more people with healthcare, and the healthcare system is going to remain the same size. That just seems to me like that's going to. I'm still confused how that's going to help small business. It may, but I'm going to wait and see how it pans out.
Before we take calls, what's your background and how did you get involved in this association?
All right, I'm a small business person. I got involved in it when one day I was a sales manager for a computer company in Northern California, and a young woman walked into my office crying, and she'd lost a government set-aside contract, which is a contract that's only supposed to be bid out to small businesses. She lost it to a company in Holland with 26,000 employees in 28 countries. And I went to the government's database of small businesses that night, and I found 600 of the largest companies in the world. And I went to the General Accounting Office. They launched the investigation and found, I think, about 5,500 large businesses from around the world in the SBA's database of small businesses. And I began to call Washington and try to get some help, and I finally started the American Small Business League because I couldn't find anybody that was interested in addressing that problem.
Van is joining us from Sun City, Arizona, on the Democrats line with Lloyd Chapman. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. How long have the gentleman been in, his organization been in existence?
American Small Business League has been around probably for about, I'll say, 4 years. Before that, we had another organization that's focused in the computer industry, and we found out that the abuses we'd uncovered were in all industries, so we changed it from the Microcomputer Industry Suppliers Association to the American Small Business League.
How do you define a small business?
Well, I like the U.S. Census Bureau data shows that 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees. And I think 87% of all U.S. firms have less than 20 employees. So to me, the largest number you can use is probably 100 employees.
Murphy joining us from Germantown, Tennessee, Republican line.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my call, and certainly enjoy C-SPAN. And with all due respect to your speaker, because I am a small business owner and an independent contractor and a public school teacher, with all due respect to your teacher, he's been played for a sucker. And I hope that doesn't offend him. But I have a couple of questions.
Well, first of all, what's your business, Murphy?
I own a small vending business, and I'm an independent contractor. I contract out certain services that people require.
How many employees?
Myself, and that's it. But I face the same problems that any other small business does. But I have a couple of comments and a question for your speaker. I teach American government, and I can find nowhere in the Constitution where the federal government is supposed to support small businesses or any businesses at all. It's supposed to afford an opportunity for people to achieve success. So if you're really interested in helping small businesses, your focus should be to get the federal government out of financing small business, period, and to issuing contracts to just about anybody except that deal in the free market. Second thing, regarding this seemingly attitude that the government is supposed to give people everything. When you say government, you talk to the taxpayer. And taxes are going to overwhelm my granddaughter, your son and daughters, because the numbers now are unsustainable. And I think that should be your main focus, as opposed to worrying about who gets awarded contracts and let the free market dictate the policy.
Fascinating opinion.
We get them all here on C-SPAN.
Well, basically...
So now it's your turn to answer.
Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that said we should take care of veterans or, anything like that. But basically, the Small Business Act says that, 23% of all government contracts should go to small businesses. It makes sense. That's where most Americans work. And if the caller's concerned about taxes, small businesses generate the majority of taxes. I think a lot of people see in the stories where I believe General Electric and ExxonMobil pay no federal taxes, even though they're making record profits. So I think he's the one that's being played for a sucker. If you don't understand that this country is a small business economy, and if the governments can help anybody, it should be small businesses, because that's where most Americans work. That's where all the new jobs are created. In fact, he's a small business owner. He should understand that. So I think that go to my website, ASBL.com, and look at some of the stories, and I think you'll come to understand that small businesses are the heart of our nation's economy, and that's who we should be focusing on, not Wall Street.
Vivian was responding to the caller, and as he was making his point, she was saying, yes, sir, make sure small business has not a chance against the mega corporations.
Yeah. Well, that's what's happening right here in Washington. In fact, to tell you the truth, I hate to say it, but I think that Washington is actually anti-small business. When you forget the rhetoric and the speeches that you see and just look at the policies. Every year for the last 5 years, the SBA Inspector General has said the #1 problem facing the Small Business Administration is the diversion of federal small business contracts to some of the biggest companies in the world. And yet Congress has failed to adopt legislation to address it. Even President Obama, during his campaign, said it's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. But we're not seeing any action on the Hill. I've got a bill, 2568, that will simply stop the federal government from giving billions of dollars in federal contracts a month to some of the biggest companies in the world. And it's stuck in the House and Senate Small Business Committee.
Some of the other sentiment from our Twitter conversation, and a lot of people participating if you want to join in, is that you're only interested in government contracts for small businesses. Is that fair?
I'll just say that's my main focus. Yeah, that's what the American Small Business League is focused on. We've expanded to other issues that people have asked us to get involved into them in those issues. But mainly, I'm trying to address, again, what the SBA Inspector General had said is the #1 challenge facing the Small Business Administration and the entire federal government today.
Let me take the other side of the aisle, because if you're a government contractor and you get a bid from a small business, and let's say the contract is $1 million and the small business can do it for $1.1 million and a larger company can do it for $900,000, wouldn't you want to go with the larger company that can do it at a lower cost for taxpayers?
Well, that's a good question. I think that, to tell you the truth, that it's a better investment to buy from the small business, because large businesses haven't created one net new job since 1977. And the Chapman Foundation put out a report a few months ago that said over 100% of all net new jobs, I think since 1981, have come from companies that are less than 5 years old, and that's small businesses. So if we're trying to balance a budget here in America, I don't think there's any better use for our tax dollars than investing in the small businesses where most Americans work and all the jobs are created. And quite frankly, those numbers are reversed a lot of times. The small businesses routinely can offer better pricing than the large business because their overhead's so much lower.
Lloyd Chapman is the founder and president of an organization called the American Small Business League. The website is linked through cspan.org if you want to check it out. It's asbl.com. Rick is joining us from St. Louis. Independent Line. Good morning.
Good morning. I was just calling. I've worked for small businesses. I've been an independent contractor for small businesses, and over the years, I've met a lot of people that had the capital, and that's usually who I'd work for. They didn't necessarily have to get a loan. Some of them did, but a lot of them have the capital, but they're holding back because they don't want to get into something that the administration all of a sudden has a knee-jerk reaction to spend $1 billion on something, and you're competing with the federal government with your, say, 100,000, maybe $1 million, and they decide to get their hands in it. You can't compete with the government. And I think that nobody knows which way he's going. Everybody's just sitting on their money.
Yeah, that's true. I saw a survey that said that 75% of small business owners expect the economy to go into another recession before it gets better, and 60% of small business owners surveyed disagree with how President Obama is handling the economy. So I can agree with that sentiment. A lot of people are worried. They don't know what's going to happen. And again, I think it was a big mistake for the government to focus so much of the stimulus funds to Wall Street and so little to small business. I was talking to a 7-year-old child the other day, and I said, if you were the president and you knew that small businesses created 100% of all the net new jobs, how much of the stimulus money would you give the small businesses? And he kind of looked up there and he said, 100%. I think that 7-year-old kid probably knew a lot more about economics than maybe a lot of people here in Washington, because it would have been, I think, a lot more successful if more stimulus funds had gone to the middle-class economy and small businesses.
We've talked about stimulus. Let me go to the other part of the argument that we were discussing earlier. Higher taxes, increased regulation. What concerns small businesses more?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I think they're equally, scary. Higher taxes, more regulation, no one likes that. And I'm afraid that we're in a situation, I'm not for higher taxes, and but I'm afraid that we're in a situation where that's inevitable. And to tell you the truth, I'll tell you something about increased regulation. Now, most people would say, well, we don't want increased regulation. But I think that a lot of people would agree with me. If we had more regulation over Wall Street, we might not be in this economic situation we're in right now. And if we had more regulation over the oil and gas industry, we might not have had the spill that we had. So I think in certain areas we need more regulation, like over Wall Street and over the oil and gas industry. And I think in other areas we need less regulation.
Liam has this point. Your last caller was right. It is taxpayers that foot the bill. Small business is desperate for government largesse are a drain. That's his point. Robert, joining us from Milwaukee. Democrats line with Lloyd Chapman. Good morning.
Well, you finally hit the nail on the head. But I haven't heard him say anything about our company, the Republicans, who block everything that President Obama is trying to achieve. I look at C-SPAN and I look at the Senate consistently, and I always see where the Democrats are trying to do something for small business, but those Republicans, they don't want to do anything to help President Obama, and you know what the truth is. Thank you and have a blessed day.
All right, well, Robert brought up a good point, and this is something that a lot of my Republican friends won't like to hear. But the truth is that Ronald Reagan tried to close the Small Business Administration in '84 and in all federal programs for women, minorities, and small businesses. Republicans tried to close the Small Business Administration again in 1996. And then during the Bush administration, he cut the SBA budget staffing in half. And the Bush attorney told me that President Bush intended to starve the SBA to death and end all programs for little guys. So today at the SBA, the budget is at one of the lowest points it's been in 30 years. So, I think it's true that Democrats are more pro-small business than Republicans when you look at the facts. But again, I'm not real dazzled with how President Obama and the Democrats have handled the economy and the way they've treated small businesses.
We're talking about the economy and small businesses with Lloyd Chapman. Larry is joining us from Bandon, Oregon. He's calling on the Republican line. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I'm a small businessman myself, and I kind of enjoy seeing the arguments bantered back and forth, and both parties demagoguing each other about who can do something better or worse than the other one.
Well, Larry, before you make your point, what is your business? Tell us a little bit about what you do in Oregon.
I manufacture small optical components for the aerospace industry, and it's been fairly stable for quite a while.
Do you get government contracts?
Indirectly. Indirectly, I don't have a prime contract, but I get I work with large manufacturers for medical research instruments and things like that. The point I want to make, though, is that as a small businessman, when taxes go up, it does make it harder for me to grow my company, because I have to pay all of my loans back with after-tax money. And as that margin drops, I have less money to actually pay my loans off and or grow my company. The other comment I'd like to make about employment in general is that during the previous decade, when the arguments are made about who created more jobs or less jobs, largely during the Bush administration, we had full employment. There wasn't really as much need to create jobs because the unemployment rate was less than 5%.
We'll get a response. Thank you for the call.
Well, when you talk to a Republican, or a Democrat, they're going to be very partisan. But I do think there's an argument to be made that let's say during the Bush administration, the economy was strong because of things that were done during the Clinton administration. And so now during the Obama administration, we're definitely seeing the impact of things from the Bush administration. So people, in both political parties seem to try to use that to their advantage. Maybe sometimes they'll say, well, it's true, sometimes it's not. But, there's no question that the policies of the previous administration are affecting us today. And when President Obama leaves office, his administration's policies will affect, the next president. But I would think that Larry would, agree with my position that if he's a small business, being a subcontractor to government contractors, that he would agree that Fortune 500 firms shouldn't get small business contracts. And in terms of Larry's taxes, I'm not a tax expert, but when I see that GE is paying no federal income tax and ExxonMobil is paying no federal income tax, that's going to increase Larry's taxes. So I'd like to see the tax burden spread out more evenly across the country and have corporations, pay their fair share, and maybe people like Larry, maybe his taxes would be less.
But another Larry Kudlow, was on our program last week saying just the opposite, saying in fact that ExxonMobil is among the highest taxpayers corporate taxpayers in this country.
Well, I believe that the story that I saw said they pay no taxes in America. So they may be one of the biggest taxpayers, but not in the United States of America. They pay taxes, overseas. But I could be wrong about that. But I believe that what I read, there was a lot of commotion about that they were paying no U.S. taxes. So internationally, maybe, but not in the U.S.
A viewer saying the taxes are the lowest they've been in 66 years, and see what we've gotten for it. Adrian on the phone from Denver. Good morning. Democrats line.
Good morning, guys. I'm a small business owner. In fact, two businesses. I own a clothing company and I run a mixed martial arts organization as well. And the real problem that I see is that it's clean cut and dry. Small business owners aren't spending their money where they need to spend it. And if the government, who gives grants on a regular basis, induces these companies into programs where some of the money goes where you want to take it, whatever you do as a business owner, but some of the money needs to be put here, some of the money needs to be put on Wall Street so that your firm can grow, and you can't touch this money until you become stable as an organization. You won't have these issues because a lot of people live above their means as small business owners. And with Obama, he's getting a lot of backlash. Yes, it's true, he gets a lot of backlash. But Bush ran us into the ground. This is a gentleman who just saved our economy from cratering, as John would have put it. So with that type of situation going on and guys faking their deaths on Wall Street just to get away from spending taxpayer dollars and not taking responsibility. You need a little more regulation on Wall Street, and you need a little more regulation on small business owners who don't know what to do with their money.
Mr. Chapman.
Well, I can agree that we need more regulation on Wall Street. I don't think that small business owners need more regulation so they can figure out what to do with their money. I think they probably know what to do with their money. And again, I think that if the federal government would focus more of the economic stimulus on small businesses, they'd have a lot more money, and maybe they wouldn't have the type of problems we're having right now. But I do agree with the caller that we need more regulation on Wall Street. And I'm not sure if the bill that passed the other day is really going to be sufficient to take care of the kind of problems that we've seen in the past.
How do you keep track of the flow of federal dollars to small businesses?
Oh,
Where do you go?
There's a lot of sources. There's a great company called FedMine that we use, and they've got a lot of, they have all the data on federal contracting. You can see which contractors, how much, the volume of contracts that went to each contractor. You can see the percentage of contracts that went to small business and the percentage of large businesses. We also do a lot of freedom of information requests to the federal government to obtain data, but it's fairly rarely available.
And can you provide some examples of what is subcontracted out?
Well, I'll tell you something. It's a good question. The dollars that are subcontracted out, that information is not available. I've tried to find that. You cannot find, the volume of contracts that are subcontracted by prime contractors. In fact, I've got 9 federal lawsuits going on right now because we're just simply trying to take a look at what's called the subcontracting reports for prime contractors. So the Pentagon will give a contract to a Fortune 500 prime contractor, and by law they're supposed to subcontract out, a percentage to small businesses. And yet when we want to see that information, they tell us that it's a proprietary and trade secret, and we're filing lawsuits to obtain that information, and we've never lost one of those lawsuits. And of course, when we get the information, it's generally pretty disappointing. You see the contractors are not complying with the federally mandated small business contracting goals.
Our topic, small businesses and the Obama administration. Our guest is Lloyd Chapman. He is the founder and president of the American Small Business League. Jim joining us on the Republican line from Mobile, Alabama.
Good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Chapman, thank you for appearing this morning. I've got a few comments and observations, and then I've got a question. For those of us who've watched C-SPAN for a number of years, we recall back during the 90s when the Democrats were pushing the concept of redlining, that is, where banks arbitrarily cut off certain parts of our population and would not make bank loans for home loans in those areas. Consequently, they pushed, in conjunction with the Republicans, to force banks to make loans in those so-called redlined areas. Well, consequently, those banks made those loans, but then they sold them to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac pushed them on to Wall Street. Wall Street rebundled those and sold them overseas. Well, consequently, when those loans, as they were bound to do, went bad, our economy began to collapse because we had a bunch of bad paper spread throughout the world. That's one observation. That's what's led to our current economic downturn.
Well, I'm not sure if that's the sole reason that the economy is, in the situation it's in right now. My opinion is that, again, as I said earlier, a lack of regulation in Wall Street. And I know in the last few years there was a lot of lobbying by Wall Street and banking institutions to change the regulations. I think we can now look back and see that that was a mistake. So, I can't agree with Jim that the, current economic downturn was based upon the government selling, bad loans, overseas. I can't agree with that.
Leslie is calling on the independent line from Baltimore. Good morning.
Good morning. I think this is a good program because, well, I am a small business trying very hard to secure government contracting, and I've been trying for like 6 years, and I'm going to tell you, it's overwhelming sometimes. And when you read the paper, the documentations, they give you the impression that it's a 1, 2, 3 thing. You can get in, get registered, get certified, et cetera, and you're in. But then when you finally get in there and you start trying to get involved and participate in various contracts, you'll find that the government, the federal government as well as state government, they got all types of little clauses in there to automatically discourage somebody that's trying to get in there and start something.
Caller, what's your business?
I do telecommunications cabling.
How many employees do you have?
Well, right now it's me, and it's only because, I get people as I need them, but as far as trying to get a government contract, they almost make it absolute that you almost have to go through a prime.
Have you had any government contracts, state
Yeah,
or federal?
I was able to secure participation in a project with the Maryland State Lottery Commission. The prime contractor emailed me and solicited me and asked me did I want to participate in the contract. Of course I wanted to participate. I submitted my paperwork to the prime contractor. They won the contract and promptly went about doing the contract and did not give me access to it until I found out, looking for work, I found that they were using contractors to do the same work. So I called the company. I'm like, y'all got the contract, but where's mine?
We'll get a response. Thanks, Leslie.
I've heard that story a million times. It's a common problem in government contracting where a prime contractor will, when they submit their bid to the government, they'll say, okay, we're going to do X number of dollars with these specific small businesses. And then when they get the contract, those small businesses don't get the work they were supposed to get. In fact, I was just talking to someone about that yesterday. And there's an area where there should be more regulation. Government prime contractors are really very, very loosely regulated, and there needs to be a lot more regulation of the prime contractors to make sure they do what they're supposed to do in the contracts. But Leslie's story, it's a common story that you hear. People are even listed in the contract, and they think they're going to get the work, and then when the prime contractor, is awarded the contract, they're left out in the cold. It's unfortunate, but it happens. But maybe we can get some regulation to stop it.
The debate has already begun, and we expect to hear a lot more after the August recess on the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003. What impact, if they are set to expire at the end of this year, will they have on small businesses?
Well, their taxes are going to go up. I think one thing that's interesting about small business and tax cuts that people don't understand, when you look at a small business, for example, if you have a small business in California, a moderately successful small business, you're going to be in the highest tax bracket. So the average American might say, well, if a small business is making, $250,000 a year or $400,000 a year, that's a lot of money. But when you're losing half of it to taxes, and then you've got to use that money to finance your receivables, it's hard for people to understand if you don't have a small business, but you can be making, $400,000 a year, and maybe you can only take out $30,000 a year for yourself because you've got to use that money to finance the growth of your business. So I think it's probably going to happen, but I think that small businesses are going to wind up paying, higher taxes, and I think it's unfortunate.
Robert, good morning to you. Joining us from New York City. You're next.
Yeah, I thank you for C-SPAN, and I want to thank Mr. Chapman for his work. My question has to do with, the availability of tax dollars and where they go, and it seems that no one's addressed the fact that the prioritizing of the dollars, the estimated cost for the incursion in Iraq, which was based on faulty information, is going to cost the American taxpayers. It's been estimated to be $3 trillion by the time it's done, whenever that'll be, and that money could be used for small businesses. It could be used for health care, and no one seems to have. Your last caller, your last guest was touting the Republican Party, et cetera, ad infinitum, and I just felt that the fact that the $3 trillion is being spent on an incursion in Iraq takes away money, and I'd like to hear what Mr. Chapman's opinion is about that issue.
Thanks, Robert. On the Democrats' line, your response.
All right. My personal opinion is we can't afford those wars. We can't afford it. I think that there's a good chance we could go into another recession, and a lot of European economists think that. And to me, we just simply can't afford it. And if I were president, I would stop both the wars, tomorrow, and pump up the security here in America. But I just think, we just can't afford it.
That's another topic for another segment, so we'll stick to small businesses. James is joining us from Newcastle, Delaware, also on the Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. First and foremost, I wanted to thank Mr. Chapman for everything that he's been doing. And I just wanted to mention how some of the earlier callers were definitely unwarranted in attacking Mr. Chapman. Mr. Chapman's doing a good job.
Thanks.
The second thing I wanted to mention is something that 2 callers ago had addressed, and that is the concept of teaming. A little-known fact, I'm now about to let America know a little-known secret with getting a government contract. The small business owner can actually team with a large multinational company to get those government contracts. I'll hang up and I'll let Mr. Chapman take it from here. Thank you very much.
And the term is called teaming?
Yeah, teaming. There's also a mentor-protege program. And I'll have to say, I'm not a big fan of that because it's abused a lot. But many times a small business can team with a much larger business and be part of a contract. And it works. I was talking to someone yesterday that does that. But there are a lot of abuses, I think. In fact, a lot of times what happens is the small business will be used as what's called a pass-through, where it'll look like the small business is getting the contract, but it's actually going to the large business. So it's got its positives and its negatives, but I'm not a big fan of it because of the abuses that I've seen.
On the Republican line, Marie is joining us from San Bernardino, California. Good morning.
Good morning. I agree that government contracts should not be going to large corporations, and I was wondering, should there be more regulation in that regard? Thank you.
Well, let me follow up on that point. You're not saying that they shouldn't go to large corporations, are you? You're just saying you want it equitable?
I'm saying that small business contracts shouldn't go to Fortune 500 corporations. And I would think that you'd have a hard time finding anybody in America that would disagree with that. So that's all I'm saying.
Pamela from Houston, Texas, independent line with Lloyd Chapman. You're next.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Chapman what effect he thinks free trade has on small business, because I don't hear him speaking to that issue, and I have thought for the last 10 to 15 years that is the biggest issue we face, is that it is impossible for us to compete with foreign labor sources that are charging 1/4 what the American worker has to be paid living in this country. And I know it has decimated my business. I've been in medical transcription for over 30 years in the Houston area, employing up to 30 people at one time, and now I have a workforce of 5. And every one of those contracts that has been lost to my company has gone to Indian-based companies. And I think this is what is decimating America. This is what President Obama said he would address, and he has done absolutely nothing.
Well, Pamela, I'm from Houston. I grew up in West University. So, yeah, it is a problem. In fact, yeah, I would like to see President Obama do something about that. Yeah, American small businesses are really having a tough time competing with some of these foreign companies. In fact, I was surprised. I called my credit card company one day and got a little bit of a hearing problem. I couldn't understand the guy, so I used another credit card and wound up talking to another person in India. And you see so much work here in America being shipped overseas. And I think it's a problem, and it needs something that Congress and President Obama need to look at. So I agree.
Our topic, small businesses and the Obama administration. Lloyd Chapman with the Small Business League based in California, the president and founder. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your time. In just a moment, we'll take you to the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives for today's business. Expected to be another busy day with a number of votes here in Washington. By the way, the Senate Judiciary Committee also holding a hearing on the FBI, and Robert Mueller, the FBI director, will be among those testifying today. And we'll hear from the Debt Commission, which is holding its 4th public hearing. the co-chairs, Erskine Bowles and former Senator Alan Simpson. Live coverage on our online at cspan.org. Thanks for being with us on this Wednesday. We now take you to the floor of the House. Enjoy the rest of your day.